You may be surprised to learn that many of the companies who make your favorite brand of soap or moisturizer also make your mouthwash and non-prescription drugs. For example, Johnson & Johnson own brand names such as Tylenol, Band-Aid, Neutrogena, Nicorette, and Listerine, to name a few. And they aren't the only ones who own a variety of well-known brands. PepsiCo own names such as Gatorade, Tropicana, and Captain Crunch. It is not only important to know who is behind the creations of the products that we're buying, but also the intentions and the values of the corporations who are selling these products. The term brand extension, as Henry Jenkins writes, refers to the idea that successful brands are built by exploiting multiple contacts between the brand and the consumer. Jenkins goes on to say that Coca-Cola sees itself less as a soft drink bottler and more as an entertainment company that actively shapes as well as sponsors sporting events, concerts, movies, and television series. When shopping at your local department store, it may seem as though the choices for products are endless. Though with the multiple brands companies create, it is deceiving as to how much freedom of choice the consumer really has. Two products from the same company may have very different messages. For example, the product Dove and the product Axe have very different advertising campaigns, both depicting women in a different light. If someone were to disagree with one of these advertising campaigns, they may choose to buy the other product. This gives the consumer the illusion of freedom of choice, because in the end, they're buying the product from the exact same company. We will continue the discussion of freedom of choice in part 2 when we look at media industries in Canada. As we saw in part 1, it can be hard to identify, without researching, who is behind the manufacturing of our products. The same can be said when we look at Canadian media. As authors Robert Hackett and Richard Greneau put it, appearances can be deceiving. When you take a closer look at Canadian news media, you find a lot less freedom and diversity of information and opinion than at first sight. In part 2, we will be focusing on the Canadian media, specifically how several characteristics of the media system itself threaten diversity and audience choice. Robert Hackett and Richard Greneau rate that these characteristics include high entry costs, minimal competition, and concentrated and conglomerate ownership. We will also look at a fourth characteristic, dependence on advertising. What is common in Canadian media today is the situation of oligopoly, which, as Peter Stephen defines, is whereby a group of the largest companies control the industry. Let's first look at some large media companies and their characteristics. Bell Media owns internet, home phone, and cell phone service, 28 television stations, with CTV being the #1 network in the country, 30 specialty stations, including TSN Comedy, Bravo, MTV, and much, 33 radio stations, and dozens of websites. Astral Media owns 24 television services, 84 licensed radio stations, and operates over 100 websites. It owns popular bands such as HBO Canada, Movie Network, Teletoon, and Virgin Radio. Shaw Media paid $20 million for CanWest broadcasting assets, which included Global TV and 18 specialty channels, including Mystery TV and TV Tropolis. It also runs more than over 20 websites. Quebecor is a leading media company, owning services in television, internet, newspaper, and magazine. They own 43 dailies and 250 community weeklies. They also own the largest cable service provider in Quebec. Finally, Rogers Media owns Rogers Wireless and Fido, also 54 radio stations, and Rogers Cable, which includes City TV and Omni TV. As you can see, single companies are in charge of a large media market, which comes with a large amount of power. Cross-media ownership is evident in all the companies mentioned, which makes it very difficult for any new companies to form. The high initial cost of creating a film, radio, or TV program prevents newcomers from entering the market, says Peter Stephen. For the individual who is not satisfied with the media situation, it is almost impossible for them to compete against the wealth and reputations the large companies have accumulated. This conglomerate ownership, high startup costs, which lead to minimum competition, are responsible for the lack of consumer choice. The text Mass Communication in Canada reads, "Where private ownership is dominant, considerations of profit-making and advertiser interests, focusing on groups with disposable income, prevail over considerations of public service." It then states, where public ownership prevails, the wide range of interests among members of the public are better served. One of the key economic dynamics affecting the Canadian media system is its greater dependence on advertising, which accounts for more than 70% of daily newspaper revenues, about 64% of magazine revenues, and much of the income for broadcasters, notwithstanding the importance of cable TV subscription fees. The heavy reliance on advertising in Canadian media harms our freedom of choice, because much coverage of international events in Canadian media is still supplied by large multinational, usually American-based, news agencies. It is more economical to print or modify their copy or to televise their images than it is to send reporters overseas. Thus, overseas news reported from a Canadian perspective seems likely to be a blind spot in the media, ultimately taking away our choice altogether to get a Canadian perspective. The few major points that we've talked about in this documentary are that many companies own a multitude of well-known brands, that it is important to know who is behind the brands, their attitudes, and beliefs, and that companies owning a large amount of brands limit the freedom of choice of the consumer. We also learned in part 2 that the media is very concentrated. Lack of competition caused by high startup costs, concentration and conglomerate ownership, and also dependence on advertising threaten consumer choice and diversity. Private ownership is less concerned with the interests of the public, but more on revenues. And the reliance on advertising often hinders the creation of Canadian content. I encourage you to look at the media industry and brand industry critically and determine for yourself what fits your values and wants. Though sometimes our freedom of choice may be limited, by educating ourselves on topics such as these, you will better be prepared to make decisions that are best for you and your family.